As you might have heard, Sony announced new products today. One of them was the Sony A1 II, so the new flagship camera from Sony. And the other one that I find almost more interesting is the Sony G-Master 28 to 70mm f2 lens. I have a very similar one from Canon, but the Sony looks very impressive, especially because it's a bit smaller and much lighter. So I want to talk a bit about the new specs, if I think they are relevant for wildlife photography or not. And I actually also bought a new camera today, so my credit card suffered quite a bit today. So I want to talk a bit about which camera I bought and why I bought it for wildlife photography. So the Sony A1 II has still the same 50 megapixel sensor that the original Sony A1 had. And I don't think it's a bad thing because this was an excellent sensor. It had very similar noise levels as my Canon EOS R5, which was lower noise levels than Nikon Z9 or Z8. Not drastically, but it was a bit better. It was a stacked sensor with a very fast readout. We had 30 frames per second. One new feature that we have for the Sony A1 II is the pre-capture. And I think that's a really cool one for wildlife photography, and you can basically set how much of a pre-capture you want. I think the maximum is 1 second, so that's a very welcome improvement. We also have a new body design that is much more similar to the Sony A9 III with this screen that you can basically tilt or swivel in all axes, which I think is much cooler than what the Sony A1 had. The viewfinder is also improved. It's a 0.9 times resolution with around 9.4 million dots, but now we have a refresh rate of 240 frames per second. I'm not sure if it's such a big difference to 120 frames per second. To be honest, with 120 frames per second, I had no problem following birds, but we will see. Any improvement is always welcome. And we also have several improvements in terms of the autofocus. So one big thing is that the autofocus now has an automatic subject recognition, so it can automatically switch between mammals and birds. And this is really cool because I found this a bit annoying with the Sony A1, especially coming from Canon, where you can just put it to animal and it tracks birds and mammals very well. And the Sony A1, when I was in the Alps taking pictures of ibex, but also of birds, I needed to move back and forth all the time, so I definitely welcome this new feature here. Apart from that, the IBIS has been improved, so we get now up to 8.5 stops of image stabilization, at least in the center, and I hope that we really see some differences in the video, because in my opinion this was where Sony was lagging a bit behind. Nikon was kind of the leader with giving the options to have very smooth handheld video. Canon was somewhere in between, but with Sony I was really struggling, even with a 400mm 2.8, to have stable handheld video. So we will see how this will be in the future. One thing where I'm not completely sure is if the camera has a CF Express 4.0 or if it's still using the older generation of CF Express cards. I know that Canon, for example, decided not to put the CF Express 4.0 in the R5 Mark II and the R1, and I was a bit disappointed about that. I would also be disappointed if Sony now did the same, because these are really expensive cameras and they would profit from faster cards, I guess. So it makes me wonder if there is a technical limitation why they didn't do it. Maybe these faster cards produce even more heat, and this would cause the cameras to overheat. I'm not sure, but we will see. I have no doubt that the buffer will still be quite good on the A1. I'm just thinking now that we also have the pre-burst, maybe it would have been nice to have these newer and faster cards. Overall, I had the impression that some people were not so happy with the rumored specs that turned out to be true now, because it's a rather minor upgrade. And I agree, it doesn't seem like a huge upgrade on paper, but I think the Sony A1 was the big revolutionary camera. With Canon we had something very similar. The R5 was revolutionary, the R5 Mark II was a refinement, but it was still a worthwhile refinement, at least for me. Better autofocus, better video capabilities, better image stabilizer, things like the pre-capture that is added, and that is really important for me. So I think it's the same for the Sony, and Sony A1 was my favorite camera, at least until July or so, before Canon announced their new cameras. And I think the few weaknesses that the Sony A1 had, they were basically fixed now with the Sony A1 Mark II. So in this sense, I think it's a well-designed camera. And for those that don't want to spend more money, well, just keep your A1, or if you don't have an A1, maybe now it's a good opportunity to buy a used one, because the used market, I could imagine, will grow over the next months or half a year. So I think this could be interesting. What I find overall a bit more interesting is the new Sony G Master 28 to 70mm f2 lens, because it's so much lighter than the Canon version. The Canon weighs 1.4 kilograms more or less. I've shot it and I was quite happy with it so far, but if I looked at Sony now announced the lens that is 500 grams lighter, yeah, I'm getting a bit jealous, I need to admit that. We will see how it performs in practice, but this seems like a very interesting lens to me. And I think now we can move to the new camera that I bought myself. Maybe some of you already kind of guessed it, but today I went to my photo dealer and I picked up the Canon EOS R1. Yes, I know, it's a 24 megapixel camera, and originally I was not interested in this camera at all. But after using it for like 10 days or so, I was really amazed how well it fits or sits in my hands, the buttons that I can customize to my liking basically, the giant clear viewfinder, just so many things that I like about this camera. Why did I buy a new camera in the first place? Well, I had the R5 Mark II and then I had my old R5, and I had a few problems with the old R5. I found like the whole, it was too distinct in terms of the usability from the R5 Mark II. I was thinking about either getting a second R5 Mark II or maybe an R6 Mark II or wait for an R6 Mark III. But at the same time, I was craving for something a bit more professional, and therefore I went for the Canon EOS R1. For some videos, I also want to have the R5 Mark II in my hands and show you something. At the same time, I want to film myself, and I could not do this with these LEDs in the background because they would start to flicker, and the R5, the Mark I, didn't have this flicker avoidance or something. Only the R5 Mark II and the R6 Mark II and so have it. So now I have two cameras that can do that. One of the reasons why I went for the R1 in the end was I really like how the body feels. I mentioned the big viewfinder. And also the fact that we have two CF Express card slots. This means I can write redundantly without losing speed or without decreasing the buffer size. Speaking of speed and buffer size, it's faster than the R5 Mark II. It has a bigger buffer than the R5 Mark II. I can switch more easily from photo to video with this small switch here, which was really driving me crazy on the R5 Mark II because it was on the left side, so I could not reach it when taking wildlife pictures. The R5 Mark II has also been overheating a few times in the past, depending on room temperature when I was doing YouTube videos. This never happened with the R1. And the high ISO performance was also better on this camera. So yeah, I'm really excited to use it in the coming weeks, months and years, how it will perform. If I will be happy about it, because one downside that I see is, even though I like the big body, of course it's a bit heavier, and if I want to get really low, the integrated battery trick might be a bit annoying. And one other thing is it's not the same as the R5 Mark II, so now I will have two different cameras and I need to set them up in a way that I have the most important functions on buttons that both cameras have at basically the same position. So I need to see a bit here how I will do it. Let me know what you think about the new equipment that Sony announced. If you already got your R1 as well, what do you think about it? Thanks for watching and see you in the next video.